Defending Israel with David Harris is made possible in part by Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Paul and Lynn Light Family Foundation, To Life, to Love, the Patricia Worthen Ullman Foundation.
Hello, JBS viewers. I'm David Harris, and welcome back to Defending Israel. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke to you about what I believe to be the urgent need, the long overdue need for the Jewish advocacy world to catch up with events. In other words, to move from an October 6th playbook to an October 8th playbook. I focused on this theme not just a couple of weeks ago, but essentially since October 7th, that fateful day. A number of you contacted me since that monologue and said, can you please share some more about it? And I'd like to use this occasion to do exactly that. Let me begin by mentioning a name that may or may not ring a bell for you. Surfside. Surfside was an apartment building in the Miami area. And in 2018, the structural engineers visited this apartment building and detected a weakening of the foundation through erosion, whatever. And they told the building owners, unless you do something about this, it's going to be very dangerous going forward. You're taking a big, big risk. It took several years for the building owners, the shareholders, the condo owners to come to a decision that they have to do something. It would be costly. But by the time they made that decision, it wasn't long after that much of this building collapsed and nearly 100 residents of the building died. Why do I mention Surfside today? Because in a way, I see the Jewish Advocacy Foundation as also experiencing fissures, cracks, weaknesses, and unless the structural engineers inside the Jewish community speak up and alert the Jewish community, no, we can't continue as we have in the past because our building may not survive in the way we need it to survive. The structural integrity has been weakened. And if our advocacy organizations choose to kick the can down the road, to turn a blind eye, to bury their heads in the sand, or to say, you know, it's too difficult, this isn't the right moment, then I fear it's not going to be too long before we face even further challenges. Or let me put it another way. In the year 2000, some of you will recall, the Republicans announced their presidential ticket. It would be George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. And early polls in 2000 suggested they'd be a tough ticket to beat. Al Gore, who had been vice president to Bill Clinton for 8 years, was the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party. And the question became who would be his vice presidential nominee. And I can only imagine, in those smoke-filled rooms somewhere in Washington, people gathering, and someone having the bright idea to say, the way to ensure the success of this ticket is to nominate a Shomer Shabbat, a Sabbath-observing Jew, a strong Zionist, Joe Lieberman, who will not travel on Saturdays and won't eat ham and cheese sandwiches, even for campaign purposes, and whose wife's name is not Muffy or Puffy, but Hadassah. And that, ladies and gentlemen, could help us win the election. And so sure enough, the Democratic bigwigs nominated Joe Lieberman to join Al Gore, and in a way, they were proven right. They won the popular vote, and all but for one Supreme Court judge, they would have won the election in the year 2000. Many of you will remember the story. Why do I tell this story? Because now, fast forward 24 years, it's 2024. The Republican ticket, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, could be a strong ticket. The election's going to come down to 7 battleground states. We heard virtually nothing about the other 43 states. But those 7 states were going to tip the election in one direction or another. Many observers said there is one person that the Democratic Party could nominate to be the vice president who could actually help the party win one or more of those key battleground states and perhaps lead Kamala Harris to the Oval Office. And that person, Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. Again, Pennsylvania being one of those critical 7 battleground states. But the Democratic bigwigs conferred and came up not with Josh Shapiro, not even, by the way, with anyone from the 7 battleground states, but came up with the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, knowing that Minnesota was probably in the bag anyway for the Democrats. And you know the rest of the story. The Democrats lost all 7 battleground states, including Pennsylvania, and ceded the White House to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Now, Josh Shapiro, as many of you know, is a proud Jew, a proud Zionist, a very effective governor, and an individual who's been able to forge quite a large bipartisan consensus in Pennsylvania around practical policy issues. But he wasn't selected. Now, some will say it was because the chemistry wasn't quite right, or perhaps he was overly ambitious. But folks, let's be real. Politics is first and foremost about getting yourself elected. If you're not going to get elected, the rest doesn't matter. But the Democrats decided to bypass Josh Shapiro, if you will, the Joe Lieberman of 2024, and ultimately they lost the election. What happened in those 24 years between the decision to nominate Joe Lieberman and the decision to bypass Josh Shapiro is another way of framing the challenges that we face. Or put yet another way, when my youngest son went to a particular Northeast university, he would constantly reassure my wife and me that all was fine there at that university. Being Jewish, being a friend of Israel, Dad, there were no problems here. This university is firmly committed to Jewish safety and security and deeply committed to its partnerships with Israeli universities. Fast forward from when our son went to that university, a colleague of mine today sent his son there just 2 years ago, and that son, like mine, proudly Jewish, proudly pro-Israel, practically has to wear body armor in order to grapple with his being Jewish and his being a friend of Israel on that very same campus. What happened? And I'm saying all of this to frame the circumstances. And obviously, since October the 7th in particular, we have faced fatalities from Los Angeles to Boulder, to Washington, D.C., and even before, fatalities from Pittsburgh to Jersey City and Rockland County and beyond. Things have changed dramatically in America for American Jews. And woe be us if we don't recognize those dramatic changes and ask the hard questions, why? What's different? Because there are those, and I meet them quite often, who still wish to believe in their illusory thinking that this is just a passing moment, that we will return to the heyday for American Jews not that long ago, and all will be well. Maybe if somehow the Gaza war ends, maybe if there's a change in leadership in the Israeli government, Maybe there's a change in leadership in the US government. But they're missing the point, I fear. The point is something much deeper has changed. And these things don't happen overnight. They happen over time. And we need to come to terms with it. No, it's not pleasant. No, we all wish that we could still live in that kind of bubble, which was the bubble for America in the post-war period and for American Jews as well. I dare say that growing up just after the Second World War to two Holocaust surviving parents, I, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, as I grew up, as I went to school, to college, to graduate school, and began my career journey, I can say that I never encountered a single hurdle or impediment to my lifetime aspirations as a Jew. Sure, there was perhaps this club or this university that wasn't as welcoming to Jews. Okay, but nothing serious, nothing life-changing. And then my wife and I had 3 children who, to this day, and now they're adults with their own families, never encountered a single barrier to their lifetime or career aspirations as Jews. We had made it. We had achieved American fulfillment. The promise of the American dream extended to us as well. I mean, I remember I was still at university. In fact, I was on the search committee at the University of Pennsylvania that selected Martin Meyerson to become the president. And unbeknownst to me at the time, he was the first Jew nominated to be president of this Ivy League institution. We learned that at Dartmouth, John Kemeny, another Jew, was being nominated as its new president. And suddenly the Ivy League, which had never had a Jewish president lead for some 300 years, had 2. And once the dam broke, we lost count. I remember the name Irving Shapiro when he became CEO of DuPont, one of the Fortune 500 companies. And it was big news because he was apparently the first Jew to lead a Fortune 500 company, and this was the 1970s. And since then, with the dam broke, we've lost count. So the bubble made sense. It's not that we were living in illusions. It made sense. We had made it. But meanwhile, perhaps unnoticed at first, things were changing. And I've illustrated in some ways, obviously there are many more ways, and now we face a situation, back to Surfside, where we have erosion of the foundation, serious cracks that could be threatening. We have, for example, a Democratic Party, the party of Harry Truman, of John Kennedy, of Lyndon Johnson, of Bill Clinton. And yes, though some may not agree with me, of Joe Biden, who, whatever the issues were, was and remained a Zionist, a self-proclaimed Zionist through the end of his presidency. And now we have a majority of Democrats in the United States Senate who are voting against arms transfers to Israel in the midst of war, some of whom are accusing Israel of genocide. We have here in New York City, where I'm recording this program, the prospect of Zohran Mamdani running as a Democrat and potentially becoming the next mayor of this great city and the largest Jewish concentration anywhere in the world outside the state of Israel. And we even have some other Jews like Bernie Sanders, Jerry Nadler, Brad Lander, Ruth Messenger, who have openly endorsed Zohran Mamdani, Mr. Globalize the Intifada, Mr. Control the means of production, as the next mayor of this city. That didn't happen overnight. We have universities, my own alma mater, I'm told by a knowledgeable dean. My university, which went from roughly 1/3 Jewish not long ago to perhaps 12% today. We had on another JBS show, Shabbos Kestenbaum, who recently graduated from Harvard University, telling the JBS audience that Harvard went from roughly 20% Jewish in its student body to somewhere around 4% in its entering classes. We have newspapers like the New York Times, which were once essential reading for all of us. My goodness, I was 9 or 10 years old and went to summer camp in Maine, and the first thing I asked my parents was to get me a subscription. I wanted the New York Times every day of the week in my bunk in Maine, even at that young age, and read it continually through most of my life until I canceled my subscription. And until we stopped during my days as CEO, any advertising in the New York Times because of the dramatic shift. The Washington Post being not far behind, National Public Radio, which so many Jews had supported for so long, no longer the National Public Radio that at least we think we remember. Human Rights Watch, founded by Robert Bernstein in the late 1970s as a noble expression of human rights, especially the defense of human rights behind the Iron Curtain, having evolved into an organization that has made Israel, of all nations on earth, the central enemy of all that human rights today stands for, and that had to lead Robert Bernstein, its founder, to remove himself and denounce the organization, the Frankenstein's monster that had been created. I can keep going. So the question becomes, if all of that is the case, then we simply can't accept those who say, you're overstating it, you're throwing wild punches, you need a rest. Something has changed significantly, dramatically. The building's foundation is weakened, and we need to understand what we do about it. Now, here in New York, a number of years ago, again, I show my age, we had a retail clothing store called Cy Sims. Some of you may remember Cy Sims. And their motto, as I recall it, was, an educated consumer is our best customer. And I am saying to you today, JBS viewers, borrowing from Cy Sims and adapting, we need educated donors. We need educated activists and ambassadors of the Jewish people. You know, we Jews, when it comes to universities, become micro-specialists in all the apparent differences between Harvard and Yale, or Princeton and Penn, or Michigan and Michigan State. We study, we visit, we ask, we inquire. When it comes to health, if there's an issue in our family, we rightly seek to understand the best hospitals, the best doctors, the differences between Johns Hopkins and Mass General and Mount Sinai and the Mayo Clinic. But when it comes to Jewish philanthropy, in today's day and age, too often we're on automatic pilot. Well, I gave last year, I gave 5 years ago, my parents gave, my grandparents gave, I was honored 10 years ago. So there's a kind of assembly line approach. I gave, so I'll continue to give. And I'm saying today, given the reports of the structural engineers on our Jewish advocacy scaffolding, that's not good enough. We need to take the same educated approach that Cy Sims wanted us to in retail, or that we do in higher education, or that we do in health and medicine, and apply it to the Jewish world. And very specifically, we need Jewish organizations that not only have a noble mission statement, many do, God bless them, but mission statements are easy to write. The problem is fulfilling them, and especially in the more complicated, treacherous world we live in today than at any time in recent memory. So we need to ask, not just about mission statements, and not just, frankly, about what let's call output. Output being organizations that flood you, your email or your ears if they're meeting with you, with the number of trips they took, or the number of press releases they issued, or the number of meetings they had. The standard for us today should be outcome. We need to understand, as educated supporters, educated philanthropists, educated activists, where are the outcomes? Who is really making a difference? In fact, who even understands the changed world in which we live? And I would say, to be very explicit, let's begin with AIPAC. The U.S.-Israel relationship today is as critical as ever, and yet we see cracks. We see cracks, particularly, as I mentioned, in the Democratic Party today. But don't become complacent about the Republican Party, because we have voices in the Republican Party that are not uninfluential, that are either drawn by an isolationism, which says, who cares about the Middle East? It's not our business. Or some vague Christian nationalism or ethno-supremacy. People like Tucker Carlson, and Candace Owens, and others who are trying to have their voice heard. For the moment, it's a minority. Don't ignore it. But that also means that we need in both parties the strong pro-Israel voices. The Democratic Majority for Israel is another organization that's vital to the equation. The Republican Jewish Coalition is equally vital. We need strong voices in both parties. And remember, no matter how partisan any of us may be, we want this party, not that party. In our society, the pendulum swings. It goes in one direction, it'll go in the other direction. And when one or the other party occupies the White House or dominates the House and the Senate, if, God forbid, there's another crisis or challenge facing the Jewish people and the state of Israel, we can't afford to wait for the pendulum to swing in your favorite direction. We need to be sure that we have friends who understand and support our causes, as they have in the past, from Soviet Jewry to Ethiopian Jewry to the battles at the UN, and of course especially to the US-Israel alliance. We need, as I've said before, organizations like ISCAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which the indomitable Natan Sharansky chairs, and I have the privilege of serving as vice chair. ISCAP has been prophetic and fearless for years, even before October 7th, in saying, yes, something is going on that's perfidious, and it's not just an overnight story, it's a strategy. It's a strategy of money. It's a strategy of targeted influencing. It's a strategy of investing money in both political parties, in media outlets, in corporations, in culture, in the United States, in Canada, in Europe. And unless we get to that money, unless we find out where the money is going and from whom, we're missing the boat. And much of that money, it turns out, as ISCAP has revealed, comes from Qatar. It's inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood. And now we have an administration in Washington whose Secretary of State has said banning the Muslim Brotherhood is in the works. I quote Marco Rubio, in the works. ISCAP has been supporting that for years. Now we have in Congress members on both sides of the aisle who are saying, we support the banning of the Muslim Brotherhood. Will Jewish advocacy organizations step up and support the banning of the Muslim Brotherhood? Will they stand up and point the finger at Qatar and its funding? Will they ask questions about why administrations over the years have not been enforcing Section 117 of the Higher Education Act, American law that says universities have to report foreign gifts of over $250,000? ISCAP has been pushing the envelope. The Foundation for the Defense of Democracies has also been a strong voice in this space, saying it very clearly not with minced words, not pulling punches, but saying very clearly at a time where we need clarity, not obfuscation, clarity, what needs to be done. We have organizations that have said, unfortunately, too many institutions in this country only understand legal action. And so we're going to use lawfare and the existing laws, and where need be, pressing for new laws to challenge institutions, universities, and others that actively discriminate against Jews, violate laws on boycotts against Israel, whatever the case may be. And while too many of the marquee organizations are frozen in the headlights and still trying to use cute phraseology or meetings based on reason and nothing else, these other institutions are rolling up their sleeves and saying to universities and others, unfortunately, we have to resort to these means because otherwise you're not paying attention. You're playing us, to use the Israeli word, for friars, for suckers. We're not going to be friars or suckers any longer. Those lawfare organizations, groups like the National Jewish Advocacy Center, the Lawfare Project, the Brandeis Center for Justice, the International Legal Forum, they merit and deserve our full support. NGO Monitor, an Israel-based group with global reach, has been pointing the finger at these so-called NGOs that try and depict themselves as being impartial. Groups like, yes, Human Rights Watch, groups like Amnesty International, Oxfam, and others that have lots of clout with the media and elsewhere. And NGO Monitor has fearlessly taken them on and exposed them. So too, United Nations Watch, based in Geneva, which has also said, this is not a time for mamby-pamby talk. This is a time for specificity, and let's ground our positions in unassailable research. And UN Watch has been focused on UNRWA, has been focused on Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Envoy, has been focused on the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, has been focused on the fact that the UN has never, not once, in a resolution condemned Hamas by name, never. And Lord knows how many times have they condemned Israel for simply trying to protect itself, defend itself against genocidal terror. These are the kinds of organizations that we need. We need organizations that ask at universities, why have Jewish students been fewer in number? What impact has DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion had on universities? That ask questions about who should be our allies and partners, and sometimes too often cling to old allies and partners rather than looking for new allies and partners. We're living in a changed world. That's the headline. And we Jews and Jewish advocacy organizations need to understand, absorb, retool, and reflect that new world. And I'm saying that too often the marquee institutions, the institutions that we have for so many years trusted to represent and defend us, are still steps behind. But other organizations, fortunately, have emerged, are standing strong, are speaking truth to power, and are focused again, and I can't stress it enough, not on output, not on blinding you with lots of noise and images and words, but focused on outcome. When ISCAP, for example, put the follow the money issue on the national agenda of the United States, or helped put the Muslim Brotherhood issue on the agenda of the United States, or helped persuade Texas A&M University to end its contract with Qatar, or expose the connection between Brown University and the Choices program for too many high school districts in the United States. Those are outcomes, and we need more of them from more organizations. So my bottom line to you, dear JBS viewers, is become, in the words of Cy Sims, educated activists, educated donors, educated philanthropists. Ask the hard questions, focus not on output, but on outcomes. And let's ensure that our foundation is rebuilt and restored for many years to come. This is David Harris, defending Israel, and looking forward to seeing you again next week.